Podcasts on UNC-TV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.
The conference, The Black Atlantic and the Biographical Turn, Slavery, Migration, and Origins of the Modern World, takes place this Thursday through Saturday at the National Humanities Center in Research Triangle Park. The conference brings together scholars from many historical disciplines to discuss the preservation of Black history. Mitchell Lewis recently sat down with two of the conference's organizers to get a preview.
Dr. John Wood Sweet, Dr. Lisa Lindsay, welcome to North Carolina Now.
Thank you for having us.
Now, the both of you are co-chairs of the upcoming conference at the National Humanities Center called The Black Atlantic and the Biographical Turn, Slavery, Migration, and the Origins of the Modern World. Lisa, I'll start off with you. Define the Black Atlantic.
Well, it's a term that scholars have been using now for about 20 years to conceptualize the geographic space of the African diaspora as a whole, and to look at that physical space where Africans and people of African descent have moved since the 16th century, but also to conceptualize it as a space of cultural and intellectual and even political exchange. And so one of the things that caught our attention about the Black Atlantic is that it has been studied very much as a space of aggregate changes, so aggregate cultural changes, things that come out of the Black Atlantic. And it's also been studied in terms of numerical aggregates, where scholars have looked at, for example, precisely how many enslaved people were taken up in the slave trade, how many slave ships there were. But what we want to do with the Black Atlantic in our conference is to make that personal, and to look at and to populate the Black Atlantic, if you will, with personal stories.
Now, John, as Lisa mentioned, she was talking about some of the scholars, and during this conference, you've got scholars coming in from across the United States as well as abroad. Why did you all decide to pick this specific topic?
Well, Lisa and I are colleagues at UNC in Chapel Hill. We have offices next door, and we talk about our work. And a couple of years ago, we noticed that both of us are writing biographies of people who were swept up in the Black Atlantic and traveled around the Atlantic Basin. And she's working on a man who left South Carolina and went back to Africa in the 19th century. I'm looking at a man who started out in West Africa and ended up in Connecticut in the 18th century. But both of them are biographical approaches. And what we noticed was that increasingly there's a whole host of historians working in West African history, in Brazilian history, in Caribbean history, in U.S. history, who are all turning to biographical life stories as a way of understanding the Black Atlantic, populating it with individual characters, humanizing it, and prompting us to rethink what we assume about the history of the slave trade and its legacies.
Lisa, what type of topics you hope to discuss at the conference?
Well, we've invited contributions along two lines. One is biographical studies of the kind that John was just talking about. We are each writing biographies. We know of a number of scholars who are writing biographies of individuals who moved around what we're calling the Black Atlantic in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So one piece of the conference will be bringing to light these unique and fascinating life stories. Another piece of the conference will be a more analytical piece where scholars step back and say, okay, what does the totality of these life stories tell us about slavery and its aftermath in the Atlantic world? And conversely, what can these life stories also bring to biography itself as a genre? How does biography look if taken through this lens as opposed to the lens of the founding fathers or the other kinds of biographies that are more commonly on the shelves in Barnes and Noble and so on?
Now earlier you in talking about the history, you were saying that there was a blurring of sorts when it came to perhaps talking about the Black Atlantic. What did you mean by that? Or if John, if you want to take that question on.
There are a couple of broad themes that come out of this new work on the history of the Black Atlantic. One of them is the blurring of the distinctions between slavery and freedom. In American history, we tend to think in terms of stark ruptures. We think 1808, the United States joined Britain in abolishing the international slave trade. Therefore, it must have ended. Well, no, it didn't. More than 3 million people, African captives, were transported across the Atlantic after that date. Secondly, we tend to think of events like the Civil War as fundamentally transforming the United States. Well, the Civil War did fundamentally transform the United States, but it led to a long period of Jim Crow and segregation. Similarly, we see in all parts of the Atlantic world much blurrier distinctions between slavery and freedom and restrictions on individual freedom under conditions of colonialism or under conditions of segregation and white supremacy. So what we see is a wide variety of ways in which individual freedoms are limited. Slavery is part of a much bigger set of freedom struggles in the modern world.
So what do you hope that folks who come to the conference, what do you hope that they take away from it?
I think there are two basic things I want people to take home from it. One is we often think of the history of the slave trade and its legacies as a fundamental rupture that disrupted the connection between African people and their relatives in the Americas. So we think of African Americans, for example, as people who are disconnected somehow from their history. And one of the things that we learn by reconstructing the stories of individuals who've traveled around the Atlantic is how much we can know about individual trajectories from Africa back to Africa around the Atlantic world. So one is that these stories are recoverable, often in dramatic and intimate ways. And the second is a bigger point about the place of the United States in world history. And one thing we see is that the United States is interconnected to a much broader series of processes. And sometimes the United States' role is relatively marginal to the broader dynamics that created the modern colonial system in the Caribbean and South America and the modern colonial order.
And Lisa, since you and John are both working on topics dealing with the Black Atlantic, what do you hope that this conference will bring as far as your work, the work that you're doing?
Well, first of all, I should say I'm extremely excited to have the opportunity to talk about biography in the Black Atlantic with the amazing array of scholars who are coming for this conference. They're coming from a range of universities, from Australia and Brazil as well, and Canada, as well as the United States. And so there's a synergy that we hope to achieve by having all of these interesting thinkers working on biography in the same place, talking about it. And furthermore, for my own biography in progress, I'm optimistic and hopeful that it will help me think about some of the larger issues of telling the story and framing it in terms of a contribution to the study of slavery in the Black Atlantic. The story I'm writing is about, John mentioned, an African American from South Carolina who in the 1850s moved to Nigeria looking for his roots. And he spent the rest of his life in Nigeria until he died in 1893, and was caught up in wars that were feeding the slave trade, and then witnessed the imposition of British colonialism. And his descendants kept in touch with their American relatives back in South Carolina in a conversation that has lasted through the generations up to the present. And so I see this as a real opportunity to talk about the blurriness between slavery and freedom, the shadiness between slavery, emancipation, and colonialism, and also the ways that these issues look differently from the vantage point of the United States versus, in my case, colonial Africa. And having scholars come to this symposium who specialize in African history and American history and European and South American history, as well as the history of slavery, it can only be of benefit in talking about my project and their own projects and John's project as well.
So John, if people want to find out more about the conference, tell us, when is it going to take place and where can they go to find out more information?
The conference will take place at the end of February on Thursday the 24th through the 26th. And you can look for more information on the web at the National Humanities Center website, which is www.nationalhumanitiescenter.org.
Dr. John Wood Sweet, Dr. Lisa Lindsay, you are both associate professors of history at UNC-Chapel Hill and the co-chairs of the upcoming conference at the National Humanities Center, the Black Atlantic and the Biographical Turn, Slavery, Migration, and the Origins of the Modern World. Thank you so very much for stopping by and sharing your information with us.
Thanks for having us, Mitch.
Podcasts on UNC-TV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.